Dear participants, we continue our Summer School of Theology 2025, and this is our second lecture. So I've shared already with participants during our break schedule of the summer school and the lecture description. So if you don't have it, you haven't received it yet, you can use those files. Also, all those files are available on our website on the page with the Summer School of Theology 2025. So I want to invite Roman Solovey, our good colleague and also my teacher and great Ukrainian theologian, Roman Solovey, who is also the director of our institute, Eastern European Institute of Theology, and also regional editor for the Lanham Publishing, Roman Solovey, to introduce our today's speaker.
Thank you, Ksenia. It is my really great privilege to briefly introduce Dr. Diane Langberg. I have very good memories from when I, for the first time, watched her lectures on YouTube, and I was really inspired and challenged quite a bit by her presentations and her ideas on power balances and imbalances in Christian context. And I'm really happy that she is able to join us again for this school. So Dr. Diane Langberg is globally recognized psychologist with 54 years of clinical experience working with trauma patients. She has trained caregivers from 6 continents in responding to trauma and to abuse of power. For 29 years, she directed her own practice in Jenkintown, Diane Langberg, Ph.D. and Associates, now in partnership with Dr. Phil Monroe, who was our speaker on previous school. With Dr. Phil Monroe, Langberg, Monroe and Associates continues this work, which included 17 therapists with multiple specialties. And Dr. Langberg will talk today about trauma challenges during wartime and how still, in spite of everything what is happening during wartime, we can cherish hope in our hearts and in our lives. So, Dr. Langberg, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I am very honored to be here. I want to just briefly mention before we start about the picture of the house, which I think all of you saw, and wanted to tell you where that came from. My husband took the picture, and it is a few blocks from my home, and it is a church that put out a sign that said, "We are with Ukraine." And I just wanted you to know that as you struggle and suffer, and often, I'm sure, feel alone in the world, that there are people around the globe who are with you and praying for you. Now listen. We think of him as safe beneath the steeple, or cozy in a crib beside the font. But he is with a million displaced people on the long road of weariness and want. For even as we sing our final carol, his family is up and on that road, fleeing the wrath of someone else's quarrel, glancing behind and shouldering their load. While Herod rages, still from his dark tower, Christ clings to Mary, fingers tightly curled. The lambs are slaughtered by men of power, and death squads spread their curse around the world. But every Herod dies and comes alone to stand before the Lamb upon the throne. It is my understanding that here in Ukraine, close to 7 million people have fled the country, and close to 4 million have been forced to relocate to different areas of Ukraine. That means that over 10 million of your countrymen have had to flee what they knew as home. Many of you listening today have lived with war or are currently living with war. Many of you are living in war. that means that you are living with fear, with great losses and constant grief. War has changed your country, your life, your family, your friends, and perhaps your faith. People you love have died. Friends you trusted have left you. And perhaps God himself seems to have abandoned you as well. War has changed, and it continues to change you. You, your family, your children, your friends, your church, and your faith will never be quite the same. You are no longer a person who has not known war. The power of others has attempted to crush your country. Many of you have cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me? And some of you have found silence to be the only response. You are living with evil. You did not seek it and did not choose it. It is not what you want for yourself, for your family, your friends, the next generation, or for your church. But evil remains present in your lives. Those conditions constitute trauma, and it is attempting to heal from trauma that I want to be speaking to you about today. One of the things we know from both research and experience is that healing from trauma requires, first of all, a sense of safety and stabilization. Providing a secure environment is almost universally considered as the first phase of treatment for trauma. Providing safety necessary for forming an alliance with the trauma survivor so that you can look back at what was overwhelming and traumatic and finally begin to speak the truth, to name your feelings, and to integrate traumatic memories into your present life without being swallowed up from them yet again. But what happens when there is little to no safety? What do we do when life continues to be danger-filled, uncertain, and unstable? How do we respond in a way that is helpful and builds resilience when we are unable to offer stability and safety, even as the first step? Some years ago, I was in a counseling session with a combat vet who had recently returned from the war in Iraq. And he talked about how the Army tried programs to help in Iraq the soldiers who were dealing with the war and with trauma. The idea, he explained, was to intervene therapeutically immediately so as to diminish symptoms when they returned home. But the soldier told me that this approach was not working, and the soldiers neither liked it nor trusted it. He said this: they want us to put our guard down and tell them how we feel about killing people. And then they want us to pick up our guns and go back out there and kill some more. What makes them think we can do that? Another example of attempting to treat trauma in the absence of establishing safety around, some years ago, I sat in a supervisory session with another therapist who was working with a woman who had lived with relentless ongoing violence from her husband. The client had asked her, "What's wrong with me that I cannot get over the trauma of his abuse?" The therapist, in turn, asked me, "What do I tell her?" My answer was, "You cannot get over something that is still happening." It seems to me that attempting standard trauma work in the midst of ongoing trauma is the equivalent of undressing someone who is standing in a life-threatening blizzard. You simply end up putting them at greater risk and more harm. The traumatized person is an utterly overwhelmed human being. The dictionary tells us what overwhelmed means: bury or drown beneath a huge mass, or defeat completely. A trauma is the equivalent of a personal tsunami. Take a moment to think about being buried or submerged. You can't breathe, you cannot see, you cannot move. You want to claw your way out. Your heart races. You think you might die. Now, what happens if during the course of this awful experience, I come along and helpfully begin asking you to tell me your story, and I question you about the kind of feelings and experiences it evokes? Remember, you can't breathe. Getting your next breath is what you are thinking about. The point, of course, is that in the absence of secure situations, when trauma is ongoing, it cannot always be approached in the way that therapists are accustomed to working. Another feature of working with trauma involves addressing and reducing the trauma's vigilance by the victim. When we work with trauma survivors, they are usually hypervigilant, and should be, to the extent that this gets in the way of their present-day functioning. In the relative safety of the consulting room, therapists work with those experiencing hypervigilance by helping them learn how to get grounded and manage their anxiety. One of the main issues that my soldier client was making was that he needed to be hypervigilant. He was in combat. People with guns want to kill him. His safety would be jeopardized if he let down his vigilance. Again, the point is that most of the established trauma work today for people who are suffering assumes that the trauma is over. It is past, and that the therapeutic process can proceed in safety. How can healing proceed when danger constantly prevails? How do we approach those who are traumatized and despairing when both they and we are under siege? One thing I can tell you for certain is that those living with trauma are the only ones who can tell us what is helpful and what is not. Helpers need to ask those who are in harm's way what they think would be helpful. What helps when you confront ongoing, relentless trauma on a daily basis? Here are some ideas I have used and written about throughout the years. The first of these is voice. Trauma is the experience of the self being silenced. The words, feelings, thoughts, and choices of the victim are very often squashed. When we are overwhelmed, we are focused on surviving, defending, getting out, or disconnecting from the stress. Normally, when we are hurt, we cry ouch. Whether confronted by war, rape, or natural disasters, the victim's ouch is often completely shut down. Their opinions, their ideas, their thoughts, and their feelings can be completely disregarded and seen to be irrelevant. The experience of trauma is diametrically opposed to the image of God in human beings. The voice of God spoke everything into existence. He entered history as the Word made flesh. To be created in His image, as you are, is to have a self that projects itself out into the world. To be in His image is to have a voice, creative, expressive, that will be brought to bear on this world. Your voice should matter in this world. When someone has been brutalized, when someone has lost everything, or everyone he or she loves, their own voice can also be crushed. The self is shattered, fractured, silent. The self does not speak who it is until into an unsafe world. Why should they? How do we respond to this silencing? We do it by bearing witness, by listening to and giving legitimacy to silence and the voice of the trauma victim. Listening, not hushing, not interrupting, not even with the words that are meant to be reassuring. The task that confronts us is to help the victim of trauma to find his or her own voice. When I was a very young therapist, just learning about trauma, I was confronted with a new client who sat down in my office and uttered not one word for the entire session. After several of my questions or attempts went unanswered, I also shut up and sat with her in her silence for the remainder of the schedule. I did that because I didn't know what else to do. I did not know what else to do that might help her talk. I'd never encountered such a thing before. When our session entered, I was racked with self-doubt and a sense of failure. Did I fail her as a therapist? Would an accomplished therapist have gotten her to talk? To my considerable surprise, she came back for her follow-up appointment. And this time, upon entering and being seated, she said this: "You gave me a great gift last week. You allowed me to be as I was. I felt honored that you regarded me as being worthy of just sitting with." And I would add to that, I'm sure many of us have had times of suffering in our lives where we have gone on our knees before God and we have no words. And He's there. That is how He wants us to be, like Him. The second concept I would like to impart is that of relationship. We were created in relationship to God Himself and to one another. God did not only create us in relationship, He entered the world Himself in order to reestablish relationship through His death. His image is reflected in relationship. The voice of the triune God has said, aloneness is not good for us. Humans long for safe relationships. We seek it out, even as infants. Trauma violates and shatters connection. It brings betrayal and fear and humiliation and loss of dignity. It brings shame and it destroys safety. In essence, trauma removes the components of good relationship. Trauma isolates. It endangers. It creates barriers. It destroys bonds. It is also has a profound impact on our relationship with God Himself and can lead to His being viewed through a distorted lens. The violation and destruction of faith during the time of great suffering and the loss that we feel is one of the greatest tragedies of the traumatic experience. Now, this is not to say that we should challenge or correct a victim's feelings of alienation from God. Rather, the point is to understand that these feelings can arise in reaction to trauma. Our role is to listen, to sit with, to walk with, not to confront and correct. A third concept in working with traumatized people is to understand that they feel utterly powerless. They often are. God called us as people to rule and subdue. Those are power words. They mean go have impact, go make things happen, grow, go create and change things. Trauma removes and squashes power. The victim feels helpless, useless, powerless, and ineffective. The loss of dignity that results from this is profound. All of these things, voice, relationship, and power, are rooted in the character of God Himself and evidenced in the image of God in human beings, you and me. Trauma can destroy the essence of what it means to be human and to diminish the dignity of carrying the image of God. Dignity, vibrancy, impact, creativity, building, producing, all are life-bearing, and all are silenced and crushed by trauma, especially by chronic trauma. Anything we do in response to trauma needs to be built on the foundation of the image of God in us. And we must work in restorative ways towards the recovery of that image in the one before us. At the same time, anything we do must not replicate the experience of trauma or be destructive to that image. So let us take these three aspects of the image of God, voice, relationship, and power, plus our own understanding of the experience of trauma, and weave them together as we think through how to respond to a person living with ongoing and relentless trauma, such as wartime. In brief, we want to restore voice, build relationship, and increase power while not overwhelming the self or increasing fear or helplessness. These are the parameters of this work. Honor of the other, the image-bearing one, is foundational to working with them, to walking with them. We honor their voice. We honor their choices, including their refusals. No, I don't want to talk about that. Okay. Their culture, their current circumstances, their ways of expression, and their need to not be overwhelmed yet again. When I teach about living with trauma memories, the first stage involves the talking, the tears, and the time. The talking is obviously about telling the story with all its facets. However, as we typically think about it, to tell the story is to immerse oneself in it, to let down one's guard, to face and feel again exactly what one wants to forget. To do so is to become vulnerable yet again. Encouraging vulnerability in a person who is going through ongoing trauma can be very unwise. Instead, supporting and strengthening the already traumatized person who is facing even more trauma in the initial work that needs to be done. Those of us who are therapists often feel that unless we are urging a trauma to speak about or relive their trauma, we are somehow not doing our job. In fact, sometimes our work is to sustain and strengthen the person for whom traumatic events are ongoing. You can't put them down into trauma if they're living in trauma. You'll do great damage. Attention to those things that will serve to ground and nurture our client is what we are called to do. Encouraging refuge in places that are offered a taste of safety, like sitting with you. It might be the only 20 minutes they have that's safe for a whole week. Fostering a focus of the beauty of nature. Did you see that flower? Let's go over and look at it more closely together. And the support of understanding friends, fundamental to ethical trauma work when trauma is ongoing. These things are vital and they are safe for the victim. If we invite a victim who continues to be subject to traumatic events to tell his or her story, we must ask it in a way that allows the control to reside with them, not with us. For example, we might say, I would like you to tell me about your story to whatever degree you choose, for the purpose of working together to think through how you and your family can protect your hearts and minds and bodies in the midst of your ongoing suffering. The statement restores dignity by giving them voice. We are saying, tell your story in whatever way you choose, not according to the way that I lay it out, as much or as little as you wish. In doing so, we are restoring a sense of power and control into a broken person. You are bestowing dignity by partnering with them, not doing it for them, singing a duet together and honoring their reality. Another vital aspect of our work is to welcome lament. Lament is a contained way of telling the truth about your story without getting lost in it. We lament over injustice, over trauma, grief, and loss. Lament is spoken to God. Lament is full of emotion. It can be done collectively, which binds people together. Lament can tell the story and express the tears and connect to God and others, and God and others weep with. There is much that is restorative in lament, which makes grief more manageable. In closing, let us return to the importance of restorative relationships in trauma work. I believe that in responding to those living with ongoing trauma, relentless trauma, we need to begin with fostering and building community. We see this in Christ, whose disciples and the women who were with them, who were present when they were present when he met with people. They were present when he spoke to others, to crowds. Those groups who followed him held together when he died. He sent Mary Magdalene and Joanna to tell the disciples that Jesus had risen. 2 women ran from the tomb and reported to the men the news that they wanted and needed to hear. Christ fostered community above his disciples and the countless others who followed him. He taught them how to work together and follow him. These fundamental social processes are redemptive for us humans. In them, God is calling us to once again be image bearers. The healing priorities in addressing continuous suffering are these. Number 1, ongoing connection and community. We need to know better how to do that with our neighbors, with our church members, with our friends, a sense of belonging together, able to share one another's sorrows and even the little joys that sometimes arise. Number 2, a sense of community, purpose, and meaning. All of this is not happening for no reason. It will bear fruit. God has said so. We know it's true. His cross is bearing fruit in our lives. And 3, which includes lamenting together, singing together, worshiping together as reminders of God when he appears absent to us, when it seems like he has abandoned us. These are simple, basic things, but they fight against despair, all of which cause trauma to choke hearts and minds and souls. These things bend toward life and participation in it, even in the midst of ongoing trauma. It is the strengthening of all that will them to live. I'd like to leave you with some brief thoughts. First, from C.S. Lewis, taken from the book Learning in Wartime by David Downing. And then second, from the contemporary Christian artist Makoto Fujimura. C.S. Lewis, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, was a man who fought in World War I and who, for many years, carried shrapnel lodged in his chest. He tells us that the memories of that last war haunted his dreams for years. He woke up in the war night after night after night. Lewis described war as magnifying every anxiety that we feel during times of peace. It just makes it much bigger and more present. War, he said, includes the threat of ever temporary evil. Evil's not going to go away, is what war says to us. Pain and death, which is what we fear from sickness. Isolation from those we love, which is what we fear from exile in war. Toiling under arbitrary masters, which is what we fear from slavery under war. Hunger, thirst, and exposure, which is what we feel from the poverty of war. Lewis reminds us that life itself is fraught with hazards. He saw war as magnifying the human condition by making it impossible to ignore the fragility of our lives. He even questioned the value of comparing war to normal life without war. He asserted that life is always lived on the edge of a precipice. We don't like that. We don't want it to be true. And he reminds us that the illusion of security in peacetime merely allows people to forget their mortality. Lewis tells us that war brings into stark relief the realization that temporal life must be rooted in the life of the Spirit. And here's a quote: "If we thought we were building up a heaven on earth, if we looked for something that would turn the present world from a place of pilgrimage into a permanent city satisfying the soul, we are disillusioned," said Lewis. In a similar vein, the contemporary artist Makoto Fujimura is, in his recent book called Art and Faith, which I would highly recommend, writes that, quote, "In the Christian journey, the greatest triumph, the bodily resurrection of Christ from the cross, is not the happy ending of a fairy tale, but only the beginning of the new, with the entry point being suffering and persecution. That is the way our Lord went." Here's a quote from him: "When we encounter God in the darkest moments, really in the depth of our depravities and the soul's death, we are given such a faith to believe our God despite what we see and who we are, despite how difficult and dark the world gets. The faith given by grace will not fail us." Fujimura describes the ancient Japanese form of kintsugi, the art of repairing broken teaware by reassembling it and by making it even more beautiful as you work with it than the original unbroken vessel was. Our Lord himself became that broken vessel for us. And it is that broken body, his broken body that is the most beautiful thing in the world. Fujimura likens this process to our own lives. And here's a quote from him. "And so it is with us. Through the fissures, our broken journeys with pieces of our own hearts shattered on the ground, we journey by God's grace into the new creation. God sees beyond our shattered remains, beyond all of ours, yours. He picks them up and he sings a song over us." It has been my honor to speak with you. May God bless you. May he protect you. And may you see his face, his wounded face, who is looking over you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diane Langberg, for this very deep thoughts. I'm sure that many participants and me, we can listen to you for a long, long time, listen to your wisdom. So, but we have already a couple of questions. I think that I will start with the question on the definitions between traumatized and victims and etc. So when we speak about victims or traumatized individuals, do you see a distinction between someone being a victim, just a victim of circumstances, and the person that adopts a victim identity? Because sometimes when we refer to everyone as a victim or as a traumatized person, for instance, millions of displaced or refugees from Ukraine. So when we refer to everyone as a victim or a traumatized person, there is a risk of unintentionally imposing that an identity on that people. In other words, the more we label or we see people as traumatized, the more they may begin to internalize or see themselves as traumatized. So even when they might not fully identify with like this traumatized image with themselves.
Well, first of all, the word trauma literally means wounded. So on one level, we're all human beings are wounded sometime on this earth. Obviously, there are levels of wounding. And something like a child being sexually abused for 15 years, that's a whole different level than many others. I generally don't tell somebody that they're traumatized. I let them tell me. I don't use it as a label when I work with somebody. It means wound. So that word itself, if we were just using that, obviously there's a huge difference between one kind of wound and another kind. There can be big ones, there can be lifelong ones, there can be short ones, there can be all kinds of things. But I don't use it as a label. I'm more interested in hearing from them what happened, how they feel it's affected them, where it's done damage, what they remember being like before it happened. It's always different in individuals. Even if you have two people who were both raped, it's not the same. And so the term is mostly for teaching and training as far as I'm concerned, not for telling victims.
Yeah, I'm asking this question because often when we are like me itself, we are refugees and we like connect with the other people, they immediately see you already as a refugee or as a person with a trauma. And in that way, you feel yourself already like traumatized, more traumatized than you might feel yourself. And then this agenthood of a person that is refugee, displaced person, other people. So you are shy of your own, you became shy of your own voice. because you feel that others see already you as someone like traumatized, refugee, or etc. So, yeah.
Yes, that happens a lot. It happens in all kinds of different situations. That's why many victims of rape and child sexual abuse don't come forward and tell anybody, because they immediately get labeled. But I think on the other hand, and obviously you have to be careful who you talk to. That's just true in life. You know, not everybody will respond well or carefully or anything else. But what you can do perhaps is if somebody says, you know, where are you from, whatever, and you say, well, if you want to hear something of my story, I'll be happy to tell it to you. And tell them a portion and don't label it and see what they do with it. And it's self-protective to do it that way. It's very sad that it has to be done that way, but you are correct that, you know, people slap a label on. And for somebody like me, you know, I've been around a long time. The whole thing of post-traumatic stress disorder and talking about trauma in human beings didn't even exist when I started out as a psychologist. You know, if women had been sexually abused all their childhood or whatever and talked about it, there was something wrong with them, not the person who did it. And there was no label of the effects on their lives. There was none. So that's happened in my lifetime. So now we have labels, which is a good thing in many ways, but they're always also misused. And so you have to watch and try a little bit not using those labels and see how the person is. Test them out.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. We have a question from interpreter that I received. Marichka Andrushchuk. The question is, would it be helpful in treating ongoing trauma to include a bit of grief counseling to help grieve not just what was lost, but also what could have been?
Absolutely. I mean, that's grieving is part of any work I do with somebody who's lived through trauma, because it always includes loss. And they often, some of them have not wanted to face that and face it, but that's not generally true. Most of them just don't feel safe talking about it with anybody. But yes, you can't be traumatized and not have grief. And yes, it needs to be, you need to be open to hearing about that and how it affects somebody. And people are often afraid to do that because they don't feel safe to say so. But yes, it's there and it needs attention as the person is willing to do so.
Thank you. We have the question also from Yaroslav Lalikov, and I see that we have more and more questions, so I try to be fast to read them. So how to draw the attention of the people of Christ to the refugees if they belong to another denomination of the church, so that they remember that we are all people of Christ?
Well, my experience is that there are some churches that will do that and some churches that won't. So part of it, unfortunately, wrongly, sadly, is that you have to, if you're a victim, you have to be somewhat watchful in terms of churches, because there are some who, if they find out horrific things in your life, they're going to tell you that if you ask, you're supposed to forgive everybody who did it, and if you ask God, he'll make it all better. And that's not how it works, as you know. So I think you have to be careful, and little by little, which is very sad. Or perhaps you know people who have found a home in a certain church where they have found it to be safe, and so you might ask that of some people. But just because something is a church doesn't mean that they will care for you well and understand what's happening.
Yeah, there is a similar question from Andrei Cherney, because he's asking how local churches can care for traumatized by war refugees, provide, like, if they're those refugees, they are coming from the different religious or cultural backgrounds. Perhaps you can share some practical approaches or some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, part of what they need is training, and the church has to be willing to ask for that. You know, how do you work with somebody who has been through a terrible experience, even if you don't call it trauma? You know, how do you receive them in the church? How do you walk with them? How do you care for them in a way that is healing? You know, we've done training with people in the United States and around the world and things like that about how churches ought to be, about victims from a war, about victims from terrible sexual abuse, about victims from terrible domestic abuse, and all of those things. That is, from my perspective, still just beginning to grow. I mean, nobody did that in any church when I started out. So the fact that the questions are being asked now is a change, a good one. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking, well, we'll just be nice or we'll whatever and we'll help them, but they don't really know what they're doing and how to help them and how to walk with them and how to understand. So I think that there's room for churches to have the humility to say, God's called us to care for the broken. And we don't really know how to do that very well. And so we need to ask some people who know how to do it, who do it as a work all the time or something, and let them come in and teach us some ways about how to care for those who have been crushed.
Thank you. We have many comments from our participants, and they thank you for your wonderful presentation. I see also the question from Valentina Nemerzhitska, our participant from our previous summer schools. So she thanked you, and she said, I find that one of the hardest kind of ministry for me is serving people who live with ambiguous loss. When there is no clear...
Wait,
So,
I missed part of that. Who helping people who,
like, not clear loss, with ambiguous.
okay,
So I find that one of the hardest kind of ministry for me is serving people who live with not really clear loss. When there is no clear end to the trauma, the pain becomes constant, ongoing. Whenever it's physical absence or psychological absence, the wound remains open. Serving people in that place, knowing that as long as they are here on this earth, there may be no resolution. And yet, you can't take away hope from them. That's the tension. You can't bury it, and you can't fix it. What have you learned from your own experience, your advice to our Ukrainian context?
well, yeah, yes, I certainly have worked with people through the years who I know will never get better. I mean, they may get better, but they're not going to get really better, whatever you want to call it. That they have been so wounded that it can't be undone in any level. So they have to learn how to live with that. And that's, I find it has been much of the time very hard for the church to get that, because if you know Christ and love him, you'll get better. But that's not true physically. You know, there's a lot of things that happen to our bodies that can't be fixed, and we have to learn how to live with them. It's the same with our hearts and minds when it comes to something like trauma. You know, you can't be somebody who was sexually abused from the age of 2 into your 20s and who was then sold and so forth and so on, and just wake up one day and be okay. It's not going to happen. So the question is how to walk with people who are broken and wounded, and we're not all going to feel better because it goes away. And we have to be willing to do that with them, so at least they do not walk the pain alone. I'm always, I don't know, struck, I guess, in thinking about cases like that. My Lord is going to have scars in heaven. I'm not. So we're serving him who bears scars permanently. He's not going to wake up one day and be fine. And there are people in this earth who will not live like him in eternity, but who live like him here on this earth. And we need to walk with them in that pain. Not thinking, well, if I just say the right thing or they would just listen to me, they would feel better. No, they won't. And we know on the physical level, there are things that are wrong with people. It doesn't matter what the doctors do, they're going to be in pain. Well, that's true of the heart and the soul and the body too. But we are often, as helpers, we want to feel better ourselves. And sometimes that rules the way we treat things like that. But there will be people like that, and they need us to walk with them.
Thank you. I have the question not about the first displacement and not about the refugee trauma, but the one that you are also expert in is the question about the violence and abuse in the churches. So what instruments, mechanism do you see for recovering and preventing trauma from violence experienced by people in the church from leaders? If those mechanisms works to protect the leaders, what ways do you see for recovery and protection of traumatized people?
Leaving the church, that's step one. Yes, it's very sad. It's been grievous, frankly, to be in the position that we are in and the people that come to us and how much is being brought about abuse, hideous things for years in a church where the person in charge is famous and everybody thinks they're wonderful. And if I hadn't had my heart broken before those days, it's been broken in that. A person who is a victim of that needs to leave the church, obviously, and go someplace where they will listen and believe and walk with, and also will understand. So that you can't just walk into a church and be fine if that's happened to you before in a different church. And so, you know, I've had clients who have been able to go to a church and they start out by just listening to the recording of the church. They don't go for a long time because it's safe if there's no humans there. And it also gives them a way to feel what it's like and to hear the leadership preach or teach and how they think about that or feel about that and all those kinds of things. It's a very sad, long-term process. And, you know, just sort of waking up one day and feeling fine about church isn't there. It doesn't happen. The fact that I have had the privilege of working with so many people who have been so hideously abused in churches, who love Jesus Christ, I find miraculous. They have been able to separate him from these so-called churches, and they love him and they walk with him. But the church, which is an earthly, it's the church is, we make it like it's the thing. It's not the thing. He's the thing. And to watch them find that and know that their Lord, who was ridiculed and all kinds of things, not to mention his being killed, was supported by religious leaders. So, and he's the Lord who cracked the whip and turned tables over when they were selling and buying and destroying the people in the synagogue. He gets it. And it's to him we need to run, not a service, not an organization, not.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answer. I have the question also related to the sin. The question is, should be trauma associated or linked to the notion of sin, or like the consequences of the sin?
I'm not sure of what that means
Like
related.
related, I mean, trauma as a consequence of the sin, someone's person. So should we, when we work with the people who are traumatized, to look for some sort of sins that can lead to those traumas?
You mean trauma, sin in the victim?
Yeah.
Yeah, when sometimes people say that when you overcome your sin, so you will be healed. But when you're inflicted by others, or as you mentioned, pray, read the Bible, and manage your emotions, manage your hatred toward the rapist, and then you will be healed. So it's more like a sinful reaction of the wounded person that is focused rather than the sinful action of
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is Christ, who never sinned, and he's scarred. So to assume that somebody scarred automatically sinned in that situation, it's not true. We can be scarred without doing anything wrong. I think that I mean, we certainly get people who have been taught that here at the practice. I don't, I think that that's not a safe church for somebody who's a victim, because they're going to hammer them about their sin, whatever they think it was or don't know it was or anything else, when this is a person who is wounded deeply in the name of Christ by people who said they belong to him. And so, you know, most people I know who end up in churches that tell them it's all their fault, basically, and if they would just get it right, it would be all better, don't stay. And I've never blocked them from it. You know, that's not what it looks like, because it's not what our Lord looks like. And the idea that, I mean, Christ completely blows it apart, because the idea is that if somebody did something bad to you, it's because you did something bad. Well, that's not true with Jesus. And no, none of us are Jesus. But the fact of the matter is that makes it real and true that it can be. You know, a 4-year-old girl who's sexually abused by 3 men didn't do anything, even if she walked around a room naked. It comes from the heart of the man, or whoever the abuser is. That's what the scriptures say. In case you didn't notice, I have feelings about these things. So,
We have a wonderful question also from Martha Strickland about refugees and the work with the refugees. So coming alongside refugees and trade volunteers has the inherent danger of defining trauma from your own context, because refugees, they always come from the different context. So any advice on how to avoid that?
when I work with somebody from another country or something, I ask them, you know, tell me about what's in your culture. How would your culture respond to these things? How do they think about these things? And some of those things I might like better than my culture. And some of those things I will see as being very damaging and whatever, because that's the way humans build things. But I invite them to speak about it so that I know something about what it's like. And it frees them up in some way over time to sort of separate their culture and what it does to them, or did, and Christ. He's not their culture. He may be in part of it, depending on what they're doing or not doing, but he's not their culture. He's his own culture. And having people learn that over time, and then feeling free to look at their own culture and be sad and miss a great deal of it, and also say that part's really sick, that's part of their growth.
Thank you. That's very helpful. There is also the comment from our participant, Valentina Nemrzicka. So when we spoke about ambiguous loss or like not clear loss, she mentioned that she was talking, for instance, on the situation of the uncertain long-term pain. For example, when a loved one is missing and their relatives live in a constant pain and do not know if there will be an end to their pain. It's something that we have, like when we don't know if people who are like army, people who serve in the army, they are lost or missed, and we don't know where they are. Are they in captivity, or are they where maybe they were killed? So, and families, they sometimes live like for like 2 years without like no information. So it's quite difficult to serve and to help. It's challenging to help those people. You sometimes don't know how to help them because you don't know the entire situation.
Well, on one level, you can't help them. They're suffering something that they're going to suffer. What you can do is walk with their suffering. I mean, it's not, part of wanting to help people and things is that in all of that, we want what we do to help to work. And it doesn't always, not in this world. And so working with somebody, for example, whose 20-something-year-old son was in a war 4 years ago and nobody knows where he is or if he died or if he's still alive or anything else. That's awful. That's something somebody doesn't get over because it's still there. You can't get over something that is there. And so the question is how to walk with them so they're not so swallowed up by it that that's the only thing in their life they ever do or think about, because obviously they're not in that position. So there are things that they can do or be that would be good for them, but at the same time, it never goes away. And so they could just see another young man walking in the grocery store and think of their son and want to fall down and weep. And it just happens. And it's a horrible way to live. And they need us to walk with them and understand it can't be fixed. It can't be fixed. And I'm the daughter of an Air Force colonel, and so I remember a couple of times where men didn't come home and nobody knew. Nobody knew where their plane fell, nobody knew anything. And that family had to go on without the father and any knowledge, most of them for many years. And then something happens in some country and somebody discovers part of a body and somebody figures out who it was. It's a hard, it means constant grief. There's no refuge from it. You can't make it better. And I think sometimes we don't want to walk with that with somebody because of how it makes us feel, but they need us to do that.
Thank you, Diane, for your very wise comments and thoughts, and for sharing with us your experience. Because your experience is also like a long way, and it's quite clear that this way was not really just like the easy journey for you too.
No.
So thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for being with us today. I do remember a couple of months ago, my colleague Roman Solovey, he told me, Ksenia, maybe we could invite Diane Langberg for our next summer school session. And I thought, like, it's quite challenging to invite legends like twice. But I think shortly, maybe in 2 weeks after that, you sent me your email with your concern about for Ukraine and for the situation in Ukraine that we are going through. And I just thought that that's a sign just to try to invite you again for our school session. And I'm very, very happy that you accepted our invitation. And thank you for sharing your time, your thoughts with us. I'm sure that all participants are happy with this opportunity. So thank you for being with us today, and see you tomorrow.